The courtroom was cold that morning, not from the ventilation, from the weight in the air itself. I've sat behind this bench for 31 years, and I still notice it. That particular silence right before something real is about to happen. I've been meaning to tell this story for a long time. It's one of those days I carry home with me and set down at my kitchen table and ask myself if the work still means something. If you've ever watched someone fight back against a system that was never designed to hear them, stay with me. If you've ever believed that one person standing in the right place at the right moment can actually change something, this story is for you. Hit like if this kind of story matters to you. Because what happened in Courtroom 4 that Tuesday morning, I've never stopped thinking about it. It was a Tuesday in November. The sky outside the tall courthouse windows was the color of wet concrete, heavy and unmoving. The kind of sky that feels like it's been holding something back all week. My coffee had gone cold on the corner of the bench. I'd been reading files since 7 that morning, and I hadn't noticed until I reached for it. By then, it was too late to bother. The courthouse had its usual November smell, old paper, floor wax, and the kind of anxiety that never quite leaves the walls. The fluorescent light above the defense table was buzzing again. I had submitted 3 maintenance requests over the past 2 months, 3 written requests, still buzzing. I've come to accept that the lights in these rooms are never the city's first priority. Neither are the people who sit under them. I had 14 cases scheduled that morning. Most of them looked routine from the outside. Landlord disputes, code violations, permit appeals. But I stopped treating any cases routine a long time ago. Every file on that desk is a person whose life has been interrupted, sometimes by their own choices, sometimes by something much larger than them. The difference matters. And figuring out which is which, that's where this job actually lives. The file at the top of the stack stopped me, not because of the name on the cover, because of the number underneath it, $47,000. That's the total being claimed. $47,000 in accumulated code violations, administrative penalties, and compounded late fees. I turned that number over in my mind a few times. To some people in this city, that's a beach house deposit. To whoever was attached to this file, I suspected it was something very close to everything they had left. I want to tell you something before I tell you what happened next. 3 days before this case arrived on my desk, I had received a letter from a state senator's office, Senator Gerald Hollis. His office had sent what they called a courtesy communication to all sitting judges handling residential compliance appeals. It reminded us that the city's enforcement program was a legislative priority. It reminded us that judges were expected to support enforcement outcomes consistent with current policy. It suggested that deviation from enforcement norms could be perceived as obstruction of public safety initiatives. I read that letter carefully. Then I read it again. Then I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. I've been on this bench for 31 years. I know exactly what that kind of letter is. It isn't legal guidance. It's a hand on your shoulder that doesn't want you to notice it's there. The law does not belong to whoever signed last week's memo. It belongs to every single person who walks through that courtroom door hoping for something honest. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. Someone was about to walk through that door. She came in through the left courtroom entrance at 8:43 in the morning. Her name was Clara Voss. She was 67 years old. She was wearing a coat that had been washed so many times the fabric no longer remembered its original weight. Navy blue once, I believe. Now it was something between faded and forgotten. She was short, maybe 5'2", and she walked the way people walk when their whole body is tired, but their mind has decided not to stop. She was carrying a manila folder in both hands, not tucked under her arm the way confident people carry things, held out in front of her with both hands wrapped around it, fingers overlapping like she was making sure it crossed that room safely. She walked past the public gallery without looking at it. She found the defendant's chair as if she already knew exactly where it would be. She sat down, placed the folder on the table, and then placed both her palms flat on top of it. Her hair was white and pulled back simply. Nothing styled, no earrings. She hadn't come here to perform for anyone. Her face was the kind of face built by ordinary life taken seriously. Fine lines around both eyes. a jaw that was set firm, not from defiance, but from the specific kind of resolve that forms in people who've been told no so many times that saying something one more time costs them real energy. One of her coat buttons was mismatched, a replacement, slightly too large, the kind of detail that tells you this person fixes what breaks and keeps going. She looked up at me just once before the session formally opened. Her eyes were dark brown and very still. I've looked into a lot of eyes from this bench over 31 years. Angry eyes, frightened eyes, eyes that are already somewhere else. Hers were none of those things. They were present and they were waiting, like someone who had decided that whatever was about to happen, she was going to be fully there for it. The representative from the city's Office of Compliance was a man named Dennis Pratt. He entered 3 minutes after Mrs. Voss and moved directly to the opposing table without acknowledging her. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him well. He placed a slim leather portfolio on the table, set a tablet on top of it, and clipped a printed summary to the outside edge. He sat without fidgeting. His posture was the posture of someone who had walked into rooms like this many times and had never once lost. I want to be fair about Dennis Pratt. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't someone I needed to defeat. He was a man who had learned to trust the system completely and had been rewarded for that trust many times over. He believed in documentation. He believed in procedure. He believed that the numbers, if gathered correctly, told the full and honest truth about any situation. He was right about a great many things. He was wrong about one important one. Not all numbers arrive at the table clean. He walked through the violations in 8 minutes. 4 structural citations, 2 fire code failures, 1 unresolved utility issue dating back 16 months. Each had a documented date, a description, and an associated fine. He showed photographs from the inspection record. They were genuine photographs of genuine problems. He spoke clearly, without drama, and finished with a dollar total that he offered like a closing argument. He wasn't lying. He was simply reading the file he'd been given and trusting that it said what it appeared to say. I want you to pause here with me for just a moment. You've heard the city's version. Now I want you to hear hers. I want you to notice what she has with her and what she doesn't have. No attorney, no expert witness, no one from any organization, just a woman in a folder and 31 years worth of a life that she chose to show up and defend. What does it take to walk into a room like this alone? Keep that question close, because everything that comes next will answer it. When Mr. Pratt finished, I turned to Mrs. Voss. I told her she could take whatever time she needed to explain the situation in her own words. I told her the photographs would be addressed, but that I wanted to hear her first. She looked at me for a moment as if confirming that I actually meant it. Then she opened her folder slowly. Then, instead of looking at the papers inside it, she closed it again and looked directly at me, and she started talking. She told me the property was a small house, 2 bedrooms, a bath, a covered back porch. She and her husband had bought it 19 years ago as an investment. After he passed 7 years ago, she'd kept it as a rental, and the income helped cover her own monthly costs. For 15 of those 19 years, she had passed every annual inspection without a single violation. She had documented everything, inspector names, dates, signatures. All of it was in that folder. She'd kept records the way careful people keep records because they know one day they might need them. Then 3 years ago, something shifted in the neighborhood. A property management company called the Meridian Group began buying homes on that block, 2 the first year, 4 more the following year. And within 6 months of their arrival, properties that had previously been clean began receiving violation notices. Not just her property, 7 others on the same 2 streets. She'd noticed. She'd kept a handwritten record. Every date, every property address, every notice, and every purchase offer that followed within 3 to 5 months. She told me about the family living in the house. A mother named Rosa and her 2 children, 8 and 11 years old. They'd been there for 9 years. Mrs. Voss had charged them the same rent since the day they moved in, not a single increase in 9 years. When the fines started piling up, she made a decision. She didn't raise their rent. She didn't ask them to contribute to the penalties. She used her late husband's small pension and her own Social Security income to cover the utility payments on their home while her own fell behind. Her electricity had been shut off twice in the 18 months before this hearing. She hadn't told Rosa. The first time she'd borrowed money from her sister to restore power before anyone noticed. The second time she'd sold a small piece of furniture her husband had built by hand, a bookshelf. She told me that with the same flat tone she'd been using for everything else. Like the cost of keeping someone else warm was simply a line item she had long since accepted and would not be renegotiating. Then she told me the third thing. The thing I could tell she'd been carrying the whole time and hadn't been entirely sure she was going to say. Rosa's youngest child had a chronic respiratory condition. He needed a nebulizer running through the night. Without steady electricity, Rosa had told her they couldn't stay. There was nowhere else in the city they could afford. Mrs. Voss had looked at that child's face and made her decision from that moment forward. She would lose every dollar she had before she turned off that boy's breathing machine. She stopped talking. She put both hands back around her folder. The light above her buzzed. I looked at Mr. Pratt. He was looking at his tablet screen but not reading anything, just looking at it the way you look at something when you need somewhere to put your eyes that isn't the woman sitting across from you. I gave the room a full 10 seconds of silence. I always give the room time after something real has been said. It deserves at least that. I turned to Mr. Pratt and told him I had a few questions before we proceeded. He nodded. He looked composed. He had the documentation, and the documentation had always been enough before. I asked him to tell me the exact date of the first inspection on Mrs. Voss's property. He checked his tablet. He gave me the date, February 9th. I told him I had also requested the building access log for that property. I slid a document toward him across the bench. The building access log was a city record showing every time an inspector's badge had been used to enter a building. I asked Mr. Pratt to tell me the time the violation had been entered into the compliance system on that date. He looked at his tablet. He said 8:52 in the morning. I asked him to look at the building access log for the same date. He looked at the document I'd slid over. His hands went very still on the table. The inspector's badge had logged entry at 11:17 that morning. 2 hours and 25 minutes after the violation was already typed into the official system. I want you to understand exactly what that means. Someone had written down what they would find before they looked. The conclusion came before the evidence. The fine wasn't the result of an inspection, it was the purpose of one. A document had been manufactured and then used to bury a 67-year-old widow under $47,000 of debt. That is not a procedural error. That is a fabrication with real consequences for real human beings living real lives in a house on a real street. I also had a photograph. A neighbor on that street had taken it on their phone that same morning. The timestamp on the image read 10:58. It showed the exterior of Mrs. Voss's property clearly, the street in front of it, the front walk, the porch. No city vehicle was present, no inspector, no person on the premises at all. Just a quiet house on a quiet morning, more than 2 hours after the violation against it had already been officially filed. Mr. Pratt looked at both documents. I watched his jaw move slightly. He wasn't performing. He was genuinely working through what he was looking at. To his credit, he didn't immediately defend the indefensible. He said he would need to verify the access records with the inspection division. He said there may have been a data entry error. He said the process for reviewing discrepancies like this required time. His voice had changed. The certainty was gone. He was now a man with a very different kind of paperwork problem than the one he'd walked in with. I need you to understand the full weight of what I'm telling you, because this wasn't just about one woman and one house. This was about a system that had been producing these results with intention. 7 properties, 7 families, the same pattern each time. A violation appears, an offer follows. The offer is accepted because the fine is impossible to fight without money or an attorney. By the time I was asking these questions in this courtroom, 2 of those 7 families had already lost their homes. 2 families who might have held on if someone had looked at one building access log 1 year earlier. I addressed Mr. Pratt directly. I told him that the law exists to protect people from the very thing this evidence was describing, that enforcement authority is a public trust, that when that trust is used to manufacture outcomes rather than verify them, it stops being enforcement and becomes something else entirely. I told him that a system producing citations before conducting inspections is not a safety system. It is a wealth transfer mechanism dressed in safety language. And I told him clearly that I did not intend to be a part of it. I also told him that I was aware because I had requested the same access logs for all 11 properties cited on those 2 streets, that 4 of them showed this identical pattern. Citations time-stamped before logged entry. I told him this finding was now part of the public record. It would appear in my written decision. It would be available to any person who requested it. And anyone whose name appeared in the communication chain behind these filings, including those in elected office, would find their connection to this process documented in very plain and readable language. Mr. Pratt gathered himself one final time. He said the violations were real regardless of procedural errors. He said the structural deficiencies in the photographs existed on that property. He said the city still had an obligation to enforce code standards regardless of how citations were initiated. He said a timing irregularity didn't invalidate the underlying public safety concern. He wasn't entirely wrong about every word, but he was using a true statement to defend a false conclusion. I told him he was absolutely right that the city has an obligation to keep its buildings safe. I agreed with that completely. But I told him the question before me was not whether problems existed on this property. The question was whether these specific citations were valid. And when documentation shows a violation was recorded before a building was entered, the citation is not valid. It is not a technicality. It is not a footnote. The process is the protection. Remove the process, and you don't have enforcement anymore. You have targeting. He didn't answer. He closed his leather portfolio and set it on his lap. He kept both hands resting on top of it. The courtroom was quiet in a way that felt different from the morning quiet. This was the quiet of a question that had been asked and completely answered. I let it sit for a moment. Then I reached for my gavel. I picked up the gavel and held it before I spoke. I do that sometimes, not for theater, because the weight of it reminds me what it is. It is not a symbol of power. It is a symbol of finality, the moment when the talking stops and the deciding begins. I set it back down on the bench and I spoke clearly and slowly into the room. I stated that the citations forming the basis of this enforcement action were procedurally compromised. The documentation preceding physical inspection invalidated the evidentiary foundation of every original citation. Without valid original citations, the accumulated penalties and compounded fees connected to them had no legal standing whatsoever. The total assessed liability of $47,000 and all associated charges were therefore dismissed in full. I raised the gavel. I brought it down once. The sound moved through the room like something that had been a long time coming. Mrs. Voss did not move immediately. Both hands were still flat on her folder. I watched her. For about 4 seconds, she stayed completely still. Then she took both hands off the folder and pressed them palm down directly on the table surface, like she was feeling for the edge of something solid, like she needed to confirm the room was real. Her shoulders came down slowly, one long exhale. Not a sob, not a cry, just the sound of something very heavy leaving a body that had been carrying it for 3 years without once setting it down. She didn't reach for anyone. She didn't speak. She sat in that chair with both palms on the table and her eyes half closed, and she breathed. That single breath was the quietest thing I'd witnessed in years, and somehow the loudest. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet, but nothing had fallen. She pressed her lips together once and gave a very small nod. Not toward me, not toward anyone in particular, just toward the room itself, like a private conversation with something invisible. I asked her to come up to the bench. She stood slowly and came forward. I leaned in close. I told her that nothing in any file in this building would ever record what she had done for that family. There was no document that would note that she had sold her husband's bookshelf or sat in a cold apartment or borrowed from her sister until her sister had nothing left to give. None of that was in the record, but it was real, and I had seen it. And in this room today, it mattered. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you," in a voice so small I almost missed it. She said one more thing after that. She said, "He always told me keep the records." She meant her husband. She almost smiled when she said it, just the left side of her mouth, small and private, the kind of smile that belongs to a person you loved who is no longer standing next to you but is somehow still in the room. I recognized it. I've seen it many times from this bench. You carry those people with you into the hard rooms and they help you stay standing. Then a woman in the back of the public gallery stood up. She hadn't been listed in any document. She was maybe 40 years old, wearing a green nursing uniform with a name badge still clipped to her collar from a shift she had just come off. She apologized for speaking out of turn. She said her name was Rosa, the same Rosa. She had heard the hearing was that morning and had come straight from the hospital. She said she'd lived in Mrs. Voss's house for 9 years, and in all 9 years, Mrs. Voss had never once made her feel like a problem to be managed. She said Mrs. Voss had fixed a leaking pipe herself one February night because she didn't want Rosa to face a plumber's bill during a month when her youngest had extra medical expenses. Her voice broke once. She steadied herself. She kept going. Some moments don't need a ruling. They've already settled themselves. If you've ever had someone in your life who gave more than they ever took and never once mentioned what it cost them, you know exactly what was happening in that room. Those people deserve to be seen. Sometimes the finest thing a courtroom can do is simply be the room where that finally happens. Take one moment before you scroll. Some stories need to breathe before they move on. 2 weeks after the ruling, a journalist named Patricia Chen published the story in the city paper. She was methodical. She had obtained the building access logs under a public records request and compared the timestamps across 11 properties on those same 2 streets. She had mapped the pattern. She had traced the connection between the Meridian Group's purchase offers and the compliance citations that preceded them, and she had found the name that appeared in the internal communication trail going back 22 months, Senator Gerald Hollis. His office had been copied on compliance briefings targeting that specific neighborhood. His signature was not on the violation notices. It didn't need to be. The timing said everything a signature would have said. The story was picked up by a regional news network within 36 hours. By the end of that week, it had been carried by 8 national outlets and 3 independent investigative platforms. My courtroom received 912 written letters in the following 30 days. Not emails, actual letters. Paper and stamps and envelopes from people in 14 different states who had experienced the same pattern in their own neighborhoods. From 2 retired city inspectors who described being pressured to pre-file violation notices on properties their supervisors had identified in advance. From a law professor in Maryland who wrote that the building access log evidence was precisely the kind of documentation that civil rights housing attorneys had been searching for in cases across the country. One letter came from a woman in Dayton, Ohio. She wrote 3 full pages in careful handwriting. She said she had lost her rental property 4 years earlier because she couldn't pay the accumulated fines. She had sold to a company that turned out to be a regional subsidiary operating under a different name in a different state. She included a photograph of her house, just her house on a regular street beneath a regular gray sky. I kept that photograph. I placed it in the same drawer where I had put Senator Hollis's courtesy letter. They belong in the same drawer. They are 2 sides of the same story. Senator Hollis issued a public statement saying he had no personal knowledge of any compliance irregularities. His office conducted an internal review and found no direct wrongdoing. That review was completed in 4 days. Reviews that are designed to find nothing tend to finish quickly, but his name was now attached to a documented pattern in a public record that any person could request and read. His 3 largest campaign donors were identified in news coverage as holding financial stakes in properties the Meridian Group had acquired in the preceding 2 years. His opponent in the following election ran a television advertisement showing the access log timestamps side by side. Senator Hollis lost by 11,214 votes. He did not announce another campaign. 6 months after the hearing, Mrs. Voss came back to the courthouse. She wasn't there for a case. She came on a regular Thursday afternoon and caught me coming out of chambers into the hallway. I almost walked past her. Almost. But something made me slow down, some small shift in the air, and I looked twice. She was wearing a burgundy wool coat. It fit her properly, and it was new or nearly new. Her back was straight, not with stiffness, with the natural posture of someone who is no longer carrying something invisible on their shoulders. Her hands were at her sides, free and relaxed. No folder held out in front like a shield. No fingers overlapping to make sure something precious didn't fall. Just her hands, easy at her sides. Her face had the same fine lines, the same firm jaw, but the tension that had been living behind her eyes was gone. When she looked at me, they were warm, brown and warm and completely open. She had her granddaughter with her, a girl of about 11, dark-haired and watchful, wearing a backpack and looking at everything in the courthouse hallway with the careful attention of someone who intends to remember what they see. Mrs. Voss told me she'd brought her deliberately. She wanted her to see what this building looked like when it worked the way it was supposed to. She wanted her granddaughter to know, before she was old enough to fear it, that the law was not automatically against her. That sentence stayed with me for a long time after they left. She also told me that a local housing rights organization had contacted her after reading the story. They'd asked to use her notebook as the foundation for a broader investigation across 3 counties. She'd handed it over without hesitation. 3 additional formal complaints had been filed based on her handwritten records. And she had been hired part-time by the same organization to help other tenants and property owners document their situations before it was too late. She said she'd been doing it for 4 months. She said she'd finally replaced the bookshelf. Had a neighbor help her build a new one. Before I tell you the last thing, I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it honestly. Think about someone you know who followed every rule, kept every receipt, wrote down every date, and still had the ground move under them because someone with more power had already decided the outcome. Someone who did everything right and still ended up standing in a cold room asking for someone to please just look closely. Has the system ever done that to someone you love? I want you to tell me in the comments, not because it changes what happened, but because when enough people say it out loud in the same room, the room changes. That's how everything that ever mattered got started. I turned off the lamp on my bench, I gathered my files, I walked to the door and stood there for a moment in the dark. The buzzing light above the defense table was still going. I thought about Clara Voss's granddaughter and the backpack and the careful eyes. I thought about what she would carry out of this building and into the rest of her life and what it might cost her one day and what it might be worth. I thought about Rosa's youngest child breathing steadily through the night in a house that was still his home. The light buzzed, I turned and walked out. Some things are worth staying human for.